Smoke, screams, and silence. The fire was alive. It roared like a beast awakened, cracking wood and swallowing walls as it leapt from room to room. The house on Juniper Lane was old, dry, and hadn't seen a fire inspection in over a decade. The neighbors across the street watched in horror as flames licked the night sky, casting orange light on the rows of silent cars and stunned faces. Inside, the air was unbreathable. 8-year-old Mason couldn't speak. Smoke burned his throat, his tiny body shaking with each desperate cough. The hallway blurred in front of him, the wallpaper bubbling, the light fixtures melting. He tried to scream for his mother, but nothing came out, just a raspy wheeze, and then the ceiling let out a low, thunderous groan. Outside, sirens howled in the distance, but they were still minutes away. A group of neighbors had gathered, some filming, some screaming into phones. No one dared run inside, no one except him. Joe Landry. They called him Crazy Joe, the man who muttered to himself at bus stops and fed birds from his coat pockets. He was a fixture in the neighborhood, harmless, strange, and always alone. He lived in a crumbling rental on the corner, barely lit and rarely cleaned. Most people assumed he was either homeless or forgotten. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. But that night, Joe didn't hesitate. He heard the screams before anyone else. He was already jogging barefoot up the sidewalk, shirt half-buttoned and soaked in sweat. When he got to the porch, someone shouted, "Hey, stop, are you crazy?" He didn't turn around. The doorknob was too hot to touch, so he kicked the door, in with his bare foot. Smoke poured out like a monster exhaling. No one followed him in. Upstairs, Mason had collapsed against the wall. His knees had given out, and his body trembled in slow jerks. He was slipping under, unconscious, seconds away from choking on the thick smoke that filled his lungs. Joe stumbled up the stairs, arms shielding his face. His skin was already blistering. "Kid," he shouted. "Where are you?" A faint moan answered from down the hall. He moved toward the sound, half-blind, reaching out until he touched something warm and small. Mason. Joe didn't think. He just scooped the boy into his arms and turned. The stairs behind him were already engulfed. He had to go through the bedroom. Windows. There had to be a window. He kicked open the nearest one, tore off the curtain, and rapped the boy's face. Then he jumped. They landed hard on the bushes below. Joe rolled over Mason's body to take the brunt of the fall. His shoulder cracked. He screamed, but the boy was alive, barely breathing, but alive. Minutes later, the fire trucks arrived. The EMTs rushed to Mason while police cornered Joe. "Is that him?" An officer asked one of the neighbors. "Yes, that's the man who ran in. The weird one. I saw him earlier. He was hanging around the back of the house." "I think he started it," another voice added. "He's not right. He talks to himself. I bet he's off his meds." Joe was still on the ground, coughing, burned, bleeding. He tried to speak but couldn't. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "You're under arrest," the officer said, voice flat. "You have the right to remain silent." Earlier that day, Joe had spent the afternoon at the park talking to pigeons. He wasn't stupid. He just saw the world differently. His doctors had given it a name, schizoaffective disorder. It meant his thoughts sometimes wandered into places others couldn't see, and his emotions came fast and heavy. But he wasn't dangerous. He'd never hurt a soul. Not even when the kids threw rocks at him. He'd seen Mason before. The boy always waved at him from his porch while his mother sat behind him scrolling on her phone. Joe liked that kid. Mason reminded him of his younger brother before the accident that had taken him. Before the world turned sideways for Joe. That evening, Joe had been walking past the backyard fence when he smelled the smoke. Not from a grill. This was sharp, chemical, and wrong. He looked up. Flames were flickering behind the upstairs curtains. He ran. At the hospital, Mason's mother, Tasha, was in hysterics. Her voice echoed down the hall as doctors tried to calm. My baby, where is he? I left for 10 minutes just to get milk." The nurse placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's stable, ma'am, breathing on his own. We just need him to rest." In the ICU room, Mason lay hooked to machines, his face pale but peaceful. His lungs had taken in heavy smoke, but the doctors were amazed he'd survived at all. "Who saved him?" Tasha asked. The nurse hesitated. "A man. He's being detained for questioning." "Why?" "We're not sure yet. They think he might have been involved in starting the fire." Down at the police station, Joe sat alone in a cold cell, his hands bandaged but still shaking. He hadn't spoken since the arrest. The detective, a tired man named Harlan, leaned against the doorframe watching him. "Got anything to say?" he asked. Joe looked up slowly. His lips moved, but no words came. Finally, he whispered, "He was choking. I couldn't leave him." "Then why were you behind the house earlier today?" Joe blinked. "Birds," he said. "There were birds in the trees." "Witness says you've been watching the boy." I waved back. Detective Harlan sighed. This was going to be messy. 3 days later, Mason woke up. It was just past sunrise. A soft light filled the room. His mother was asleep in the chair, arms curled around a sweater. When his eyes opened, he blinked at the ceiling, confused. Then he whispered, the man who carried me." Tasha sprang to her feet. "Mason? Baby, you're okay. Thank God you're okay." His lips were dry, and his voice barely came out. "The fire, the man, he saved me." Tasha's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, baby. They say someone ran in. We're not sure who." "I know who," Mason said. The nurse entered, surprised to see him awake. "He's alert," Tasha whispered. "He remembers. The police were called. When Detective Harlan arrived, he brought a sketch pad and 2 photos, one of Joe and one of a man no one had yet questioned, Tasha's ex-boyfriend, Darnell. He had a history. Violence, theft, restraining orders. But he had an alibi. Supposedly. "Can you tell me what you remember?" Harlan asked gently. Mason nodded slowly. "There was shouting. Mommy was gone. The back door was open. I saw someone come in." "Did you know him?" Mason hesitated. "He was tall. Had a tattoo here." He pointed to his neck. "He was mad. He spilled something. Then everything smelled bad." Harlan froze. "Was it this man?" He pointed to Darnell's photo. Mason nodded. "Are you sure?" Tears welled in the boy's eyes. "He said not to tell. Said if I screamed, he'd come back and hurt Mommy." Outside the room, Harlan made a call. "Release Joe Landry," he said. "We've got the wrong man. Freed but not forgiven." The metal door clanged open, loud as thunder in the quiet hallway. Joe blinked at the officer standing there, holding a clipboard and keys. "You're free to go," the officer said without expression. "Charges dropped. Someone else confessed." Joe stared at him, unmoving. His body still hurt, shoulder in a sling, knuckles wrapped in gauze, cheek bruised purple from the fire escape landing. His eyes had that same distant glaze people had always avoided. He stood slowly. "Can I go home?" he asked, voice unsure. The officer didn't answer. He just walked away. Outside the police station, morning light was breaking through grey clouds. Joe stepped onto the sidewalk and for the first time in 3 days breathed fresh air, but there were no reporters. No cheering crowd, no thank you. Just cold silence. The town hadn't forgiven him. Not really. News spread. Fast by noon, every local news outlet had the headline, "Mentally ill man cleared after saving boy from house fire. Mothers. Ex-boyfriend arrested in arson attack." But the damage was done. The neighbors still whispered. People still crossed the street when Joe passed. Social media was even worse. "He still creeps me out." Just because he saved the kid doesn't mean he's not dangerous. Should have known it was that thug ex-boyfriend. Typical. Why was Joe even near the house that night? Joe didn't have the answers. He only had nightmares of smoke, of a boy's limp body in his arms, of fire biting into his skin. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Tasha couldn't stop crying. Not because Mason was safe, that part felt like a miracle, but because of the guilt. She had told the police she thought Joe was the one who started it. She'd pointed fingers. She'd even said, "He's weird. I never trusted him." Now, she sat in Mason's room, watching cartoons play on mute, her son drawing quietly with crayons. "Baby," she asked softly, "how did you know it was Darnell?" Mason didn't look up. "I saw his tattoo. He smelled like the drink he always had." Tasha winced. Darnell used to drink cheap whiskey and spray cologne over it, thinking it masked the odor. It didn't. "But why?" she whispered, mostly to herself. "Why would he try to hurt you?" Mason paused. Then he looked up and said something that made the room spin. "He thought you were home." Darnell's interrogation detective Harlan leaned over the table, watching Darnell through narrowed eyes. The man was handcuffed, sweat beading on his forehead. "You went to the house that night," Harlan said. "You brought gasoline, poured it through the kitchen. You knew Tasha lived there." "I didn't mean to hurt the kid," Darnell spat. "I didn't even know he was there. I just wanted to scare her." "Why now?" "She left me, took my stuff, told everyone I hit her. I wanted to burn her clothes, her stupid furniture, make a point." Harlan's jaw tensed. "You almost killed a child?" Darnell sneered. "Wasn't my fault. She should have been home." Back at Joe's apartment, the place smelled like dust and old soup. Joe shuffled through his cramped living room, looking for clean clothes. The couch had collapsed. On one side, birds pecked at the window. He turned on the tiny TV. A news anchor was speaking over a picture of his own face. Joe Landry, 42, was released this morning after being falsely accused of arson and child endangerment. Neighbors call him mentally unstable, but now see him in a different light. Joe turned it off. He didn't want a spotlight, he just wanted peace. But the world wasn't done with him. An unexpected visitor. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. Joe hesitated. No one ever knocked. He opened it slowly. It was Tasha. Her face was pale, eyes red, hands shaking. "Joe," she started. He looked down. "I didn't burn your house." "I know." She swallowed hard. "I came to say thank you." Joe didn't reply. "I was wrong," she whispered. "We all were. You saved my boy, and I accused you of—" Her voice cracked. "Of being a monster." Joe finally met her eyes. "I didn't go in to be a hero," he said. "I just couldn't let him die." Tasha's eyes welled with tears. "Please, can I give you something? Anything?" Joe shook his head. "No one ever believes me. Not until it's too late." Tasha stepped closer. "I believe you now." He didn't answer, but for the first time in days, his lips twitched. A near smile, redemption. News crews begged for interviews. Joe declined them all. But one morning, Mason showed up at his door with a sketch. It was a crayon drawing of Joe holding Mason with a big orange fire behind them. "You look like a superhero," Mason said proudly. Joe took it with trembling hands. "Thank you." Tasha stood nearby, watching quietly. She had done some digging, talked to the shelter Joe once stayed in, even his sister from another state. Slowly, the puzzle of Joe's life came into focus. His condition had developed after a car crash that killed his brother. He'd been in and out of psychiatric hospitals, but was never violent. He had a gentle heart, but the world had no place for men like Joe, until now. But the town wasn't done. Judging that night, someone spray-painted a message on Joe's door. "Stay away from kids." The next morning, Mason saw it on his walk to school. His face twisted with rage. "Mom, look what they did to Joe's house." Tasha saw it too. Her blood boiled. But instead of calling the police, she called the local newspaper editor. 1 week later, the article that changed everything. The headline read, "The man we called crazy saved our future." The story chronicled Joe's life, his trauma, his illness, and his heroism. It included Mason's drawing and a quote from Tasha. "I judged him, we all did. But Joe Landry risked his life for my son. He's not broken, he's brave." The article went viral. Within days, donations poured in. A GoFundMe was launched. Volunteers offered to clean Joe's apartment. A local mental health center offered free therapy and support. Even the mayor called him a symbol of silent strength. But Joe didn't want praise. He wanted peace. The twist that changed everything. Again, just as Joe was beginning to feel hope, Detective Harlan made a new discovery. Darnell's arrest should have ended the investigation, but the fire department's forensic report revealed two separate ignition points, one in the kitchen and one upstairs near Mason's room. That meant someone else had been in the house. Joe was cleared. Darnell confessed, but someone else started a second fire. Tasha's journal. Harlan paid Tasha a visit. "Do you know anyone else who might want to hurt you?" She shook her head. "Just Darnell. I cut everyone else off." Harlan opened a folder. "We found this in the remains of your bedroom drawer." It was her journal. One entry caught his eye. "Mason says he sees shadows. I told him they're dreams. But what if they're not? What if Darnell isn't the only one watching us?" Tasha paled. "That was months ago. I thought he was imagining things." Harlan nodded slowly. "So did we." Cliffhanger. That night Joe couldn't sleep. He kept hearing something. A creak, a whisper, something wrong. He sat up and peered through the window. Across the street a figure stood under the street lamp. Tall, still, watching his building. Joe's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Had it ever been there, or was his mind slipping again? He didn't know. But something in his gut twisted with warning. The fire might have been only the beginning. Shadows speak in silence. The night after Joe saw the figure under the street lamp, he barely slept. Each creak in the old building sent jolts through his nerves. The city outside sounded distant, muffled. Even the comforting hum of his mini fridge felt wrong, too loud. Something wasn't right. He paced the living room. His eyes darted to the window, searching for that shape. It wasn't just fear. It was instinct, a gut-deep whisper telling him, this isn't over. Tasha's discovery at her temporary apartment across town. Tasha lay awake as well. Mason had fallen asleep hugging Joe's crayon drawing. She watched her son's chest rise and fall in the moonlight. She opened her journal again, flipping to the entry Detective Harlan had pointed out. Mason sees shadows. I told him they're dreams. She'd written it months ago after he woke crying, terrified that someone had been in his room. Back then, she thought it was anxiety. Darnell's sudden rage, their move, adjusting to a new school. But now, there was a second ignition point, upstairs, by Mason's room, and Mason had never spoken of a second person. Detective Harlan's hunch. Harlan wasn't sleeping either. He stared at the photos laid out on his desk. Fire patterns, melted wood, accelerant stains, 2 ignition points, 2 motives. He pulled Darnell's file again, a brute, jealous but not clever. Definitely not the kind to cover his tracks or coordinate with someone. So why the second fire upstairs? And who could have gotten that close to Mason's room without being seen? Joe's visitor. Around 7 a.m., Joe opened his door to the sound of tiny footsteps. "Mason," he said, surprised. The boy stood in the hallway clutching a bag of cookies. "I brought you breakfast," he said. "Sort of." Joe chuckled softly. "Cookies for breakfast, I like it." Tasha appeared behind him moments later, apologetic. "He insisted on seeing you, said you were sad." Joe waved them in. "You're always welcome." While Mason munched cookies on the couch, Tasha leaned close. Her voice dropped. "I think someone else was in that house, Joe." That night, Joe didn't flinch. "I saw someone last night, outside, just standing there." Her eyes widened. "Who?" I don't know, but I felt it, like they weren't just watching me. They were waiting. The memory Mason hid later that morning, Harlan stopped by to speak with Mason. Gently, cautiously, he crouched beside him on the couch. "Hey, buddy, can I ask you something important?" Mason nodded. "You told us you saw Darnell that night. Are you sure that was the only person?" Mason's face changed. His eyes dropped to the floor. Tasha sat forward. "Mason," he hesitated, then whispered, "There was someone else upstairs." Joe stiffened. Harlan leaned in, voice steady. "Can you tell us what they looked like?" Mason shook his head. "They wore a mask, like plastic, and they whispered my name. But it sounded wrong. Wrong how?" Mason looked like he was trying to remember a dream. Like they didn't mean it, like they were pretending. Tasha grabbed his hand. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Mason's eyes watered. "Because I was scared they'd come back. If I said anything." The third clue, Harlan stood by Joe's front window, deep in thought. A second person, a mask, 2 ignition points. "Joe, did anyone else have a key to the house?" Joe shook his head. "I had one. Tasha had one. Darnell stole one. That was it." "What about before? Old roommates? Handymen?" Joe hesitated. "There was a guy, Ricky. He used to fix stuff, kind of a loner, creepy." "Where is he now?" Joe looked out the window, expression grim. "He got fired after Tasha reported him for looking in her windows." Tasha froze. "I forgot about that. He used to stare at me from the sidewalk. I told the landlord, but nothing happened." Harlan was already pulling out his phone. "What's his last name?" Dark secrets in daylight. By mid-afternoon, Harlan had his team combing through records. Ricky Malin, 38, former maintenance worker, fired but not arrested. His name never came up during the initial fire investigation, but now he was a suspect. The most chilling part? He still lived 2 blocks from the burned-down house, Joe's breaking point. That night, Joe couldn't stop pacing. His thoughts spiraled. Why had no one listened before? Why had Mason waited to say something? And why, after everything, was someone still watching him? The shadows in his apartment stretched long across the floor. He stared at them too long. He began to feel it again, that dangerous sensation. The one that made the world feel thin, like paper ready to rip. He squeezed his temples, rocking gently. No, not again. He couldn't go back to that place. A knock broke the moment. It was Ricky, not outside, inside his mind. Joe's vision blurred, but he could see a face behind his eyes, plastic mask, thin smile. He whispered to himself, Ricky was there. Ricky was upstairs. His hands shook as he dug through an old box. Inside, a photo. Tasha, Mason, and in the background, someone in overalls fixing a light fixture. Ricky, staring at Tasha, unaware of the camera. Joe stared at the photo so long it burned into his brain. The trap is set. Detective Harlan decided to try something risky. He called Ricky under the pretense of a follow-up on building permits. "Sure," Ricky said casually. "Stop by." That evening, Harlan arrived with backup. 2 officers waited outside. Inside, Ricky was calm. Too calm. His apartment smelled of bleach and something metallic. "You still work on houses?" Harlan asked. Ricky shrugged. "Here and there." "Do you remember the Sanderson house on Birch Street? You used to fix things there." Ricky's jaw twitched. "Long time ago." Harlan set down a photo. "This you?" Ricky looked at it, smirked. "Nice photo." "Were you there the night of the fire?" "Nope." "You sure?" Ricky met his eyes. "You got proof I was?" Joe's nightmare turns real. That night, Joe had a dream, or maybe it was a memory. He was back in the smoke, carrying Mason. As he passed the staircase, he saw something, someone moving. Not Darnell, too small, too still, just standing, watching. He woke up, gasping, and in the corner of his dark apartment, something moved. Not a dream, not a memory. Joe froze. "Who's there?" No answer, just the quiet shuffle of feet. He reached for his lamp, and in the moment of light he saw it, a plastic mask, vanishing through his door. A frantic call. Joe didn't think. He just grabbed his phone and dialed Harlan. "He was here," he said. "He was in my apartment." "Who?" "Ricky. The mask. He's watching again." "We have him in custody, Joe." Silence. Joe's heart sank. Then, who had he seen? The real twist back at the station. Harlan sat across from Ricky. He dropped a folder in front of him. "We found your fingerprints at the house, upstairs." Ricky didn't react. "So?" That was the second ignition point. "Meaning you were there when the fire started. Meaning Mason saw you." Still nothing. Harlan leaned forward. "Want to know what else we found?" Finally, Ricky looked up. "We found your burner phone, and it had messages. One in particular. One from Darnell. The message read, 'We do this clean. You scare her, I finish it. 2 men, 2 motives, 1 target. Tasha.'" The mask behind the mask, Tasha, stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the text on her phone. Fire didn't work. "But I'm not done." The glow from the screen flickered across her pale face. Her heartbeat quickened. Was this just a sick prank? Or was it him? Her fingers trembled as she called Detective Harlan. The message trail. At the station, Harlan was wrapping up paperwork from Ricky Mallin's arrest when his phone rang. "Tasha," her voice shook. "I just got a message from an unknown number. It said, 'Fire didn't work, but I'm not done.'" He paused. "You're sure it's not from Darnell or Ricky? Ricky's still in custody, and Darnell's locked up awaiting trial." "That's what scares me," she said. "If they're both in custody, who sent it?" Harlan grabbed his coat. "I'm on my way." The sound in the walls. Meanwhile, Joe sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His thoughts twisted and curled like smoke. The masked figure. It wasn't Ricky. The figure was taller, broader, and it moved differently. He glanced toward his door for the 100th time. Then tap, tap, tap. His eyes flicked to the vent above the stove. Again tap, 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 not from the door, from inside the wall. Joe stood slowly, heart thudding. He reached for a flashlight, crouched near the vent and shone the light inside. Nothing. Then something moved, fast. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. He wasn't crazy. Someone was in the walls. Tasha's past resurfaces. When Harlan arrived at Tasha's apartment, Mason was asleep. Tasha met him at the door, her face pale. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about before I met Joe, before Darnell." "What do you mean?" "There was someone," she said. "A man I dated. Very briefly. He became obsessed. When I broke it off, he threatened to hurt me." "Name?" "Luther Yates." Harlan jotted it down. "Was there a restraining order?" "I tried, but he vanished before the hearing." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Vanished?" "He left town. No trace. It was years ago. I thought it was over." "Did you ever mention him to Darnell?" Tasha hesitated. I think I did. Once." He brushed it off. Harlan's face darkened. "We need to find this Luther." Burn patterns and cold eyes later that night. Harlan reviewed the fire report. Again, something clicked. The fire upstairs near Mason's room burned in a slow, controlled pattern. Intentional. The downstairs fire. Chaotic and violent. He looked at the photos of the accelerant. 2 different brands. 2 arsonists. 2 styles. He had assumed Darnell had teamed up with Ricky, but what if someone else worked alone and used the chaos Darnell created to hide their attack? Joe's breakdown. Joe tried to explain the tapping to Harlan the next morning. It wasn't rats or pipes. Someone's inside the walls watching. Harlan gave him a long look. "Joe, are you still taking your meds?" Joe looked away. "I missed a few doses." "You need to stay grounded, Joe. For Mason, for yourself." Joe rubbed his eyes. "I know what I saw, what I heard." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "The footsteps, they were heavier than Ricky's, like someone bigger. Like Darnell? No, taller." A pause. Someone new. "Digital clues." Tasha handed her phone to Harlan. "The number that texted me. Can you trace it?" He nodded and passed it to tech support. Within the hour, the call came back. The SIM card was purchased in cash. Untraceable. But the phone had pinged near Joe's building last night, just minutes after the tapping. "Someone's following both." "Of you," Harlan muttered. "Or all three of us," Tasha said, eyes widening. The real target back in her apartment. Tasha sat alone after Mason went to school. She opened her old diary, flipping through pages from 5 years ago. Then she saw it. "Luther said he could burn down my life. I told him never to contact me again. He just laughed." She stared at the word burn, fire, watching, disappearance. It wasn't a threat. It was a plan. All these years later, he'd come back to finish what he started. The basement revelation. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in his building. He decided to investigate the basement himself. The old storage units were musty and damp, cobwebs everywhere. As he moved deeper, his flashlight caught something strange, a set of footprints in the dust. He followed them to the boiler room. There, wedged behind a broken heater, was a makeshift bed, blankets, food wrappers, a burner phone, and a black plastic mask. Joe staggered backward. He had been living in the same building as the masked man. Face to face, Joe bolted up the stairs and called Harlan. Within minutes, the building was swarming with police. They dusted the area and found fingerprints. The database lit up. Luther Yates, a history of stalking, domestic harassment, arson charges in another state, dropped due to lack of evidence. Harlan stared at the screen. He's not new. He's the architect. The missing piece. Harlan sat down with Ricky again. "This is your chance to come clean." "Who hired you?" Ricky hesitated, then caved. "Darnell paid me to distract Joe, said he wanted to scare his girl. But that wasn't the whole plan." "What was?" "He said the real show would come from someone else. Someone named Luke, or Luther?" Ricky nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was it. Said he was the one who'd seal the deal. I didn't ask questions." So Darnell's rage had opened the door, but Luther had walked through it. Mason's disappearance that evening. Tasha waited at the school gate, but Mason never came out. She called the teacher. "He left 10 minutes ago." Her heart slammed into her chest. She called Joe, then Harlan. Within minutes, an Amber Alert was issued. The last person to see Mason, a janitor with a hood and gloves, who didn't work at the school. A message of terror. That night, Tasha received another text. "He's safe for now, but don't lie anymore. You know what I want." Tears streamed down her face. She dropped to her knees, clutching the phone. "Please," she whispered, "bring my son back." Then another message pinged. "Meet me alone. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., where it all ended." She knew exactly what that meant. The burned house. Joe's decision. Joe was in a haze. His nightmares had returned. His grip on reality, weak. But when Harlan told him Mason was missing, it was like a jolt of lightning. He snapped awake. "This is my fault," he said. "He took Mason because I let my guard down." "No," Harlan said firmly. "He took Mason because he's a coward hiding behind trauma." Joe didn't answer. He was already grabbing his coat. "I'm going to be there tomorrow," he said. "I'm ending this." Final scene. Return to the ashes. The next evening, Tasha arrived at the charred remains of the old house. It was quiet, cold. She stepped through the ruins, her breath visible in the air. Then, footsteps. From the shadows emerged a man, tall, gaunt, wearing a black coat. His face was hollow, with sunken eyes, and a strange calm in his voice. "Hello, Tasha." "Where's my son?" "He's nearby, safe. But safety is temporary, you know, like trust, like memory. You don't have to do this." He smiled. "I already did." And then, a click. She turned. Joe stood behind her, holding a bat. "Remember you," he whispered. Luther didn't flinch. "Of course you do. You were there when I watched her life burn. Now you're both here for the finale." Suddenly, "Drop the weapon!" Police sirens blared. Luther turned, but too late. Harlan emerged from the shadows with his team. Within seconds, Luther was on the ground screaming as handcuffs snapped into place. From the nearby shed, an officer emerged holding a blanket. Inside, Mason. He was crying, but alive. The secret beneath the ashes, the cold steel doors slammed shut behind Luther Yates. Detective Harlan watched through the one-way mirror as the man sat motionless, eyes hollow, lips curved into a faint smile. "You'd think this is over," Luther muttered when Harlan entered the room. "But it's only just beginning." The reunion. At the hospital, Tasha sat beside Mason's bed, brushing his hair gently. He was pale but safe. Mason clung to Joe when he arrived, holding him like a lifeline. "He didn't hurt me," Mason whispered, "but he said things, scary things." Joe glanced at Tasha, heart sinking. "What kind of things?" she asked. "He said Daddy never told the truth, that the fire was supposed to take both of you, that I was just a message." Tasha's hand covered her mouth. Joe turned pale. Luther hadn't just wanted revenge. He wanted destruction. More than just madness. Back at the station, Harlan reviewed Luther's background with the forensic psychologist. "His fixation wasn't random," she explained. "It's structured, ritualistic. He doesn't just stalk, he studies, waits. He wants to rewrite the narrative of someone's life." "He knew things he shouldn't have," Harlan muttered. "Private things." The psychologist nodded. "That's not insanity. That's obsession." Harlan leaned forward. "How did he know about the fire? The baby? About Darnell's plan? Unless—" He stopped. Unless Luther wasn't working alone, an old friend's visit. The next day, Joe received an unexpected visitor. Madeline. Sure. She was his old therapist, retired now but still sharp. "I saw your name on the news," she said softly. "Thought you could use someone who knows the older chapters of your story." Joe nodded. They walked through the garden behind the hospital. "There's something I never told Tasha," he admitted. "About the first fire." Madeline watched him carefully. "Darnell wasn't the first one to try to hurt us." Joe swallowed hard. "There was a time I thought I set that fire." Flashbacks and fractures. Joe explained how, during his lowest point, struggling with manic depression and untreated trauma, he'd once blacked out in the garage. "I woke up hours later, the fire truck's already gone. I was found in the woods." Tasha had never known. "He buried it deep," Madeline nodded slowly. "But you were never charged, never linked to the fire." "No. But I kept wondering, what if it wasn't Darnell? What if it was me?" Madeline placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's what Luther wants. Doubt, fear, guilt. But you have to ask, whose fingerprints were really on that matchstick?" The hidden account. Meanwhile, Harlan received a tip from the cyber unit. A secret email account linked to Luther had over 400 messages sent to one anonymous recipient using an encrypted, disappearing email system, but a few weren't wiped. One email chilled him. "Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 requires leverage. She won't break unless the boy sees her fall." The recipient's username? Shadow Mirror 7. Harlan launched a deeper trace, and when the identity returned, his blood ran cold. The co-conspirator Tasha opened her front door to find Harlan standing grim-faced. "I need you to see something," he said. He laid a folder on the table. Inside were printed emails, each one between Luther Yates and Dr. Evangeline. "Rayner, Mason's school counselor." "No," Tasha whispered. "That's not possible." "She was helping Mason recover after the fire," Harlan explained, "but she also had unrestricted access to him, to your schedule, to Joe's mental evaluations." "She comforted us," Tasha said, voice shaking. "She fed it all to Luther," Harlan said. "Every vulnerability, every pain point. She was his mirror." The Watcher Among Us surveillance showed Rayner meeting Luther in an abandoned library. 2 weeks before the abduction, she handed him a manila envelope. The contents? Mason's artwork, school notes, and a letter Tasha had written to the school about Joe's past episodes. When confronted, Raina didn't deny the connection. "I was trying to expose them," she snapped. "Joe is unstable. She covers for him. That child is in danger." "You made him more of a target," Harlan said. Raina's eyes glowed with conviction. "I didn't light the match. I just handed over the map." Joe's inner war Joe sat alone, reading Mason's drawing, retrieved from Luther's hideout. It showed a house on fire. Inside, 2 figures. One looked like Joe, the other, unmistakably, Luther. The drawing had been done weeks before the fire. How? Had Mason known? He stared at it, hands trembling. Was this madness or memory? Then something clicked. Joe opened a hidden drawer in the basement, one even Tasha didn't know existed. Inside, he found a tape recorder, a relic from his therapy years. He pressed play. The voice that played wasn't his, it was Luther. The therapy sessions, Joe listened in horror. Years ago, when he was undergoing inpatient therapy, another patient, L.Y., was allowed in en groupe sessions. L.Y. spoke calmly, an eloquent monster. He talked about burning out the rot in people. Joe had thought he was just another disturbed patient, but now he realized Luther was there all along, studying him, learning his triggers, and somehow he had gotten hold of Joe's personal therapy tapes, which meant someone at the facility had sold them or handed them over willingly. The puppet master Tasha, meanwhile, went through Mason's room. One of his toys, a bear, had been sewn shut recently. She opened it up and found something tucked inside. A photo. It was old, of a man and a woman and a baby, but the man in the photo was Joe, and the woman, not Tasha, scrawled on the back. "This time the fire ends what it started." Tasha dropped it in shock. Joe had another family once, a past he never spoke of. Confrontation, Tasha stormed into the kitchen. "Who is she?" Joe stared at the photo. "She was my wife. Before you. You told me you were never married." "She died," he said, "in a house fire, years ago. That baby, he didn't make it either." Tasha backed away. "You never said a word." "Because I never got to grieve." "Luther, he set that fire too." Silence. Joe continued. "I was the intended target even then. But I survived. And now, he's repeating history." Tasha's voice cracked. "You should have told me. I wanted to protect you. You nearly destroyed us." The fracture point that night. Harlan put the pieces together. Luther Yates had been following Joe for over a decade, since before he met Tasha. The first fire, Joe's first family, was no accident. Luther had chosen Joe as his lifelong obsession. Why? Because Joe's father, once a judge, had sentenced Luther's own brother to life in prison. Joe's family represented justice corrupted in Luther's mind. He believed destroying Joe's life was justice, not revenge, punishment, one final. The next day, Joe received a package. Inside, nothing but ashes and a matchstick. The message was clear. This isn't over. Tasha stood beside him. She didn't take his hand. "I need time," she whispered, and walked away. Truth doesn't burn a house. Divided 3 weeks after Luther Yates was returned to federal custody, the silence in Tasha and Joe's home was louder than any fire alarm. Tasha had taken Mason to her sister's for a while, not as punishment, but to breathe. Joe walked the halls alone, each creaking floorboard echoing like a memory. On the kitchen table, he kept the photo, the one of him, his late wife, and the baby he had lost in the fire years ago. The fire Luther had started. He never imagined he'd have to explain to Mason one day that evil can wait years before striking again. And he didn't know how to explain to Tasha that he had once tried to forget that grief by pretending it never happened. A message from the Ashes detective Harlan showed up unannounced one morning. Joe let him in, wordless. Harlan placed a flash drive on the table. "You need to see this." Joe watched the security footage, Luther in his cell, pacing like a predator in a cage, but his lips were moving to someone off camera. The guards confirmed. He wasn't talking to anyone. The man was alone. But then Luther did something chilling. He mouthed the words, "She'll come back, but not as your wife," and laughed. The prison psychologist believed Luther was fixated on recreating grief in Joe's life, that even behind bars he wanted to finish the story. Tasha's choice. Tasha returned. Alone the next day, she sat across from Joe, no makeup, eyes tired. "I've watched Mason struggle to sleep. He flinches when doors slam. He doesn't draw fire anymore. He draws eyes, always watching eyes." Joe swallowed. "I've failed you," he whispered. "No," she said firmly. "You kept us alive. You built a second life when the first was stolen. You carried all that pain because you thought love meant hiding it." She reached across the table. "I don't want a perfect man, Joe. I want an honest one," Joe finally cried. Real tears of surrender, of truth. The last fire. Just when the family began stitching the pieces back together, the final ember flared. "Harlan," he called them both urgently. "There's been another fire." Tasha's stomach sank. "Where?" Harlan hesitated. "At the orphanage. The one Luther was raised in." "Was anyone hurt?" "No. It was closed down years ago. But firefighters found something strange in the ruins." He handed Joe a scorched, half-melted tin box. Inside was a photo, young Luther, about 10 years old, standing with a boy his age. On the back, scribbled in ink, "I told him everything. He promised not to forget me." L.Y. Joe blinked. He recognized. The second boy. It was him. A buried Bon Joe hadn't remembered it before, but suddenly the memory slammed into place. A group home. One summer, he'd been sent there for observation after his mother passed. He was 9. There was a boy who never spoke, who sat in corners and lit matches, not fires, just matches, and watched them burn out. They shared a room. Luther. Luther had been that boy. They'd shared secrets, and when Joe left the home, he promised. To write, he never did. Obsession born from abandonment. "Do you think this was all because I forgot him?" Joe asked Harlan. "No," Harlan replied. "But in his broken mind, maybe you were the last person who saw him before he turned." Joe sat stunned. "I told him I'd remember him," he whispered. "He made sure you did," Harlan said grimly. Final conversation. A month later, Joe requested a visit to the prison, to face Luther. Tasha supported him, hesitantly, but she understood. Luther was thinner, eyes wilder, but that crooked grin remained. "I knew you'd come," Luther said softly. "I remember you now," Joe said. "I never stopped watching," Luther replied. Joe leaned forward. "Why the fire? Why the boy?" Luther's smile faded. "Because you forgot me, and the world forgets boys like us. I wanted to be remembered. You got to have a life." Joe stared at him. "I didn't forget. I just tried to survive. And now you know how I felt," Luther whispered. "Closure doesn't always heal." Joe left the prison heavy-hearted. He had answers, but not peace. Not yet. A life rebuilt. 6 months. Later the family moved, not far but enough, a new town, a fresh home, one with no memories in the walls. Tasha opened a small art studio. Mason began therapy, then soccer. Joe at last began writing, not just journaling, but a memoir. Through the fire, what survives, when the flames die. It told the truth, all of it, the grief, the guilt, the boy he once forgot, the boy he nearly lost, the woman who stayed. The final letter one day. A letter came from the prison. No return address, just a note. "You win, Joe. I see now what I never could. A match can burn down a house, but it can't erase what lives in it. Luther Joe read it once, then burned it, not in anger, but in peace. The lesson pain leaves shadows, but it also casts light. Sometimes the past returns not to haunt, but to remind. That truth, spoken or buried, has power, and sometimes surviving is not enough. You have to remember, you have to forgive, and then you live.